We have given enough hints in the last lecture that in relating development with welfare, we have to be contextual, and the best reference to context would be the context of time. To provide a very summary indication, welfare state, developmental state began with the first era of globalization, 1817, 1914, and the decline of both coincides what we consider to be the final era of globalization, let us say 1980s onwards. I suppose this is giving enough hint that we have to take history into account. So, historically speaking, the fundamental impulse in creating, sustaining, diminishing a developmental state, and similar with regard to the welfare state, would lie in the fortunes of capitalism. So, what do we mean by fortunes of capitalism? We mean this, that capitalism has been under pressure to change its nature depending on the demands of the time. It began in 16th century, and I warn you that these are rough datings. It began as a mercantile state or mercantile capitalism. Then it became industrial capitalism. Then it became the later corporate capitalism with an intervention of what is called the Keynesian capitalism, 1930, 1970, and from 1970 onwards, the beginning of neoliberal corporate capitalism, the point of time when we are situated in this particular lecture. The developmental state had an early beginning like capitalism in 16th century. It began in Germany, then spread all over the world. So, the capitalist class needed a developmental state. That way, the developmental state is the creature of capitalism, and capitalism at particular point of time needed the welfare model, which became prominent between the time I have already located, the British time, 1945, 1974, but actually from 19th century onwards, though in a very piecemeal manner. So, the question must be, what would be the imperative of capitalism to take the developmental path and to take the welfare path just in order to survive? To that we come later. Momentarily, we talk about another experiment within the folds of socialism inspired by Marxism, and that would be the early socialist developmental state. If you take the Russian calendar, that would be from 1920 onwards with Lenin's new economic policy, and that will be 1950 onwards in China with Mao's new economic policy. Soviet Union collapsed because of a number of reasons. China survives, but in China the nature of the state, the nature of the economy and the nature of welfare have all changed in the meantime. This actually allows us to make a universal point that developmental state and welfare state and their practices have been historically adjusted from time to time, and that keeps capitalism alive. This has been the central burden of argument so far. the question which remains unanswered, to remind you, is this, that why capitalism embraced the developmental state model and why the developmental state opened the welfare path at all. That would take us to the political scenario in which capitalism was implicated. This is a known story. See, with the popularity of Marxism, with the beginning of a series of working class revolutions in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, and ultimately the October Revolution, the liberal democratic politics and capitalism both felt threatened by the socialist challenge. If you have an elementary sense of history, you recall also that between 1929 and 31, capitalism had a crisis we call the Great Depression in United States, which spilled over into West Europe and in the rest of the world. So, the economy was in crisis and the politics was under threat, and capitalism had to survive. So, they actually designed the welfare state as a tactical response. This is very vital to know, because the idea of welfare evokes the idea of humanitarian well-being, the idea of charity, as if the welfare state would be a pure humanitarian gesture. This is basically the capitalist logic or the capitalist propaganda, that the welfare state is a humane state, that capitalism is not harsh, it is humane, it can look after the miserable working class, because otherwise it could not stall the progress of the working class movement at the onset of Soviet Union, spread of socialism through the Second World War to the eastern part of Europe, to China, to Vietnam, to Cuba, and much of the so-called the post-independent state system. The global challenge to capitalism was very severe, and not in order to respond to the poorer people, pauperized people, more out of a concern with the political survival, the welfare state came into being and the developmental state came into being. And when I talk about their decline, the argument would be that capitalism, in order to survive, does not need any longer either the developmental model or the welfare model. You don't have to sort of scavenge through the history of West Europe. You can take a look at India itself, how India began. India began with what became famous, a socialistic pattern of society, the Abadi Congress of the Indian Congress Party, and everybody was talking that we can't embrace capitalism, we can't be an ally to America. That was the beginning of the famous non-alignment policy also. That India, with the rise of a man called Manmohan Singh under the regime of Narasingha Rao, they decided to actually to unhook India from what became known as the Nehru-Mohanlabis model into a more free capitalist path, the end of the so-called license Raj. And every day you find in newspaper debates going on about this particular transformation India has set its foot into. That is once again it is a global scene. The changing fortunes of capitalism, the rise of developmental state, the rise of the welfare state, the capitalism becomes secure, the decline of the developmental state and the decline of the welfare state. This is the summary of the historical connection between the timelines in the development of capitalism, timelines in the development of developmental state and the timelines in the development of the welfare state. as I put it, between the first phase and the last phase of globalization, one can encase the entire history of capitalism, developmental state, as well as the welfare state. If I spoke on a positive note, then I must also point out that this has been also the period of political turmoil, of challenges coming up, regimes falling like nine pins, old orders changing, and a certain burst of what we call the mass politics. What we discover, there is a certain churning of the people, particularly people at the bottom, those who want development to continue, but under a different model, those who want welfare to increase once again effectively, and those who would like capitalism to go. That way, as I began, it has been a political question: development, democracy, underdevelopment, lack of democracy, welfare, ill-fare, everything is connected with the question of politics, and the politics of the masses and the politics of the elite class. Largely, I have spoken in terms of West Europe, North America. I have hinted about the so-called post-transitional states. For a moment, I will explain what I mean by post-transitional state. It means the state after transition. Example 1, state in Russia after October Revolution would be a post-transition state, and the state after the decline of the Communist Party of Soviet Union would be again a post-transition state. I use this particular light-hearted comment in my class, that imagine you are an 80-year-old, 90-year-old Russian individual born, let us say, in 1905. Then in front of your own eyes, you saw the collapse of feudalism, rise of socialism, fall of socialism, and rise of capitalism up to Mr. Putin. See, if you have that longevity, and Soviet people, Russian people are famous for their longevities, they actually experienced in their lifetime how history changes its course, and along with it, how the notion of developmental state and welfare state also rise and collapse. So, what about our kind of societies? We call them metaphorically South, under single inverted quotations, the global South. The global South where we belong, basically the periphery, not the core. The core is composed by West Europe and North America. In this periphery, what you discover is this, which is very interesting, that within a very short span of time, we are trying to telescope, means we are trying to do many things at the same time. What are the things? 1, the creation of a nation. 2, the creation of a nation state. And 3, the creation of a developmental state with a welfare model. In European history, this took place quote unquote spontaneously over 3-4 centuries. This is the typical impatience of the global South, that we try to actually collapse history into small moments, and we are trying to build 3 things at the same time. What did we have in global South? In global South, we had rajas, princely states, kinship networks, and they took care of welfare. For example, if there would be a flood, there will be a zamindar to help you out. If there will be a drought, there will be a zamindar to help you out. There will be a joint family on which you can fall back. This particular so-called feudal setup collapsed in Europe, but then in Europe they had a ready replacement, so to say, the rise of the democratic developmental state. But in India or in countries like India, what you find that the feudal welfare support has decomposed, but the alternative has not been created. That would have been quite a problem, but the problem has been added to by something else, which is this, that you know that if you read the Indian Constitution, you know that the Indian state has announced to be a welfare state. It has actually designed a program of welfare, and all these are contained in what is called the Directive Principles of State Policy. This is something very rare when a constitution defines what the state must do towards the development not only of economy, of society, of culture, and what he called the psyche of the average Indian individual. This is actually a traumatic change to be worked out within a short span of time, and all either directed by the state or overseen by the state. But India entered with the promise of a change, of a vision of a new order. But then India didn't have the resources. See, let me alert you that if I talk about India, I do not mean India only, I use India only as an example. The examples point out a frantic search for what would be the appropriate path of development and multifaceted development. I can give an indication of the multifacets. The Indian Constitution prohibits that there cannot be a discrimination on the basis of sex, creed, or religion. This is astounding. India has always thrived on the three pillars of patriarchy, of Hindu hegemony and feudal culture, and the Indian Constitution in 1950 in one single stroke bans them all. And once again my request would be to close your eyes and to imagine such changes. Had you been born into the margins in India, probably would have noted how the promise was very seductive. Everybody expects the state to emancipate them politically, develop them economically, provide roots to culture aesthetically. So the Indian state is looked up by the Indian population, and the Indian state actually embraced the European models of welfare state. But then we discovered to our dismay that welfare administration has become corrupt. And Rajiv Gandhi made a famous statement that if you have a provision of 1 rupee, only 20 paisa will reach the poor, right? And that could be the logic behind Mantek Singh Aluwala's cash transfer policy also, that if I don't transfer cash directly, then panchayat or the panchayat leader would actually appropriate a good part of it. Whatever is the logic, we found that we could not actually work out the welfare state model undertaken right after the birth of the nation state. This is not a subject to political controversy. Why? Because official statistics disclose how many people are poor and the state of development. Why else you find so much of turmoil in India and almost on any particular score? And officially all political parties, they do concede that the development design has gone wrong, that welfare policies have gone wrong, and people have not actually materially improved as to their standard of living. I mean, about other indicators, better less we say, we remain correct. That being so, that takes us to the final question: what is likely to happen in India and what is likely to happen elsewhere beyond India? And that takes me once again to the main premise of my lecture, that it is a political question. That is why we are discussing in a political science curriculum. Let me begin with West Europe again, because I began with West Europe. What do we find? We find in West Europe an increase in longevity of individuals due to improved medicines, right? And the world is becoming increasingly older, you probably know, and the youngest nation is India. Hence, it is called that India enjoys a demographic dividend. What is that? That India has more young people today than any other country has, and when the other states would become older, India would still remain younger or middle-aged. What's good about youth? Youth would mean that if you impart the correct skill, then the young people become engines of development. Old people are burdens, they turn non-productive, right? And in Europe, you have a larger number or increasingly larger number of older people, number one. Number two, there is something called what you call forced migration, that you are forced to migrate from your place. And the global projection is this, that in 2020, the number of people floating in the world would be significant political question, and this is called the forced migration. We have the nearest example of partition between the two Bengals, where people were forced to move out of what was called East Pakistan to move into what is called West Bengal. These migrants, and in times of globalization, the migrant laborers who actually conceal their journey into the West in search of a job and lifestyle, that size will increase. That would mean, once again, you have to provide for employment, you have to provide for their economic sustenance. And the number of poor people, surprisingly, is increasing. See, once again, if you read the daily newspaper, you know the forecast of the size of the unemployed people, say once again around 2050. They say that in order to be educated, and the cost of education is increased, you will borrow money. It is called student loans. And by the time you pay up the student loans, you will be on an average 50 years of age, and then you will have to work till 70 in order to enjoy life a little bit. But then, only if the economy provides you opportunity to work till 70, you work and earn. And that is not being forecast. That would mean that the need for welfare continues, or the need for welfare has increased in the meantime, but the current capitalist phase actually does not like welfare to continue. Once again, if you turn to Bengal, turn to India, turn to the global south, you will find that subsidies are being withdrawn from education and healthcare. This is the new regime. This is the World Bank, IMF, United States economy dictating to the third world that you cannot continue with welfare because welfare is costly and you can't have money to spend on. In the south, if you think that you will autonomously decide on a welfare program, you are not globally allowed the freedom to organize welfare. Why? Because there is something what is called the relationship of dependency. The global south is dependent on the global north. For what? Superior military technology, superior industrial technology, superior financial grant, and the flow of Western capital into the Indian market, because the Indian market does not have sufficient capital. This is the famous debate over FDI. The moment you begin to depend on capitalism at the core in West Europe, the core capitalism demands that you cannot continue with the welfare policy. So, what is the scenario? That the traditional welfare institutions have declined. The kind zamindar is no longer. The kind zamindar who creates a school in the name of his dead mother is no longer. Feudal charity is no longer. Joint family has decomposed. Kinship has decomposed. You have nobody to turn to. But then if you want to turn to the state is also abdicating its role towards welfare, right. That would mean that in India, like in West, there is a correspondence in political realities that there is the possibility of great political troubles. West has an advantage. If you ask me what is the advantage, it is simply this: West can extract revenues from non-West. Let me give an example. Every time I brush my teeth using Colgate, the Colgate takes a part of the earning out of the Indian economy. And you probably know, with money becoming electronic money, transferring money becomes much more easier. This is advantage of West. West can have a surplus based on the exploitation of the global South, but the global South has none to exploit and have an income surplus so that it can feed on the poor and the multitude. That way, back to politics. As the state abandons development, as the state abandons welfare, people become vulnerable, the people become also available to any kind of politics in India, and you probably know that many kinds of politics flourish in India. In this lecture, to sum up, I focused on a theme I began with, the theme called dynamics, meaning thereby that the rise of the developmental state, the rise of the idea of development, or the rise of the welfare state must be read in the context of specific time and specific situations. That I explained with reference primarily to West Europe and the socialist experiment in the so-called East. But then in the days of globalization, since both models have been globalized, I had to refer to what is happening in the so-called global South, and I sort of explained that what is happening in global South and what is happening in the global North appear to be identical, namely the decline of the welfare state, but the significance and the consequences for the people therein differ, and there is a possibility of once again a great political pressure for the revival of developmental state and honest welfare state.